Welcome everybody to our third seminar from in this Science Diplomacy Seminar Series. Today we'll have Hugo Aguilaniu. So I'll pronounce it as a Brazilian. So Hugo is a scientist. He's a geneticist by training. He got his PhD from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and then went on to do his postdoc studies in the Salk Institute in California, where he focused mainly on the genetic basis of aging. Back to France, but I didn't mention he's French, so he's French, and then back to France, he started his lab at the CNRS, the National Council for Scientific Research, and then moved to the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, where he stayed until 2016, when he moved to Rio to be the executive director of the Serrapilheira Institute. So the Serrapilheira Institute, I'd say, is one of a kind here in Brazil, where scientific research is almost exclusively funded by government agencies. I'd say poorly funded, especially now. So the Serrapilheira is a private nonprofit institute who was founded to foster science in Brazil. And they act in many ways. They support scientific research by providing grants to young scientists, but also they also support scientific outreach projects in many areas of science, and as well as journalism and media. So the also helping. I missed the word in English. The communication of science. So if you go to the Serrapilheira website, they have two main goals, which would be to foster research excellence in Brazil. So as I mentioned, by providing financial support, training to scientists, but also they mention fostering interdisciplinary international collaboration in science, which I think is very much to do with our topic from our seminars. And the other main objective is building a culture of science in Brazil, which is also very important. So I'm very happy to have you, Hugo. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And I think it will be very interesting to see what he has to say about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laetitia, for your kind words and presentation, and thank you all for inviting me. It's always a huge pleasure to try to share a little bit of our experience at Serrapilheira. Today, what I wanted to do is to tell you a little bit about the Serrapilheira Institute and to tell you a little bit about what we consider to be scientific diplomacy in the context of who we are, that is a nonprofit, small nonprofit organization fostering science and science outreach in Brazil. And of course, I'll try to explain and tell you about some of the values that we think are important and how do we think we could be more let's say we could do the best job possible to get our messages and our values across, and that's not always easy, as you will see. So again, a little bit of the presentation of the Institute, because I think it's important to get a notion. We're private, we're nonprofit, and our goals is to support research and outreach. And in research, we want to support world-class science. So we're very strict about how to select our young scientists. And in outreach, we basically want to make science more accessible. And we think that this is important. And it's important to remember that this was the goals of the Serrapilheira from the very beginning. We did not start wanting to promote science and then realize that we should do outreach as well. Outreach was one of the pillars of Serrapilheira from the very beginning. So concretely, when I came to Brazil to take the responsibility of running the institute, this was presented to me. Science on one hand and science outreach on the other hand. And I thought that this was a good vision. Science outreach is making science more accessible to all, but it's also promoting science-based policy making. And in this particular moment, I would say that this is particularly relevant in Brazil. We support a large range of fields defined by natural sciences. So that includes physics, biology, chemistry, computer science, mathematics we support as well. And basic research is probably not the best translation of what we want. We want big questions. We want fundamental big questions. Most of the time, these big questions are basic research, but there are examples of very big questions that are applicable. And so we're not really keen of using this basic versus applied research, but rather big research, big questions, challenging stuff. That's what we want to support. We've been created in 2006. In fact, the Serrapilheira opened officially at the beginning of 2017, but the endowment, we are an endowed institution, which means that we have a fund that gives us some financial stability. And in Brazil, this is absolutely essential. And the endowment was constituted a little bit before the beginning of the Serrapilheira in 2016. Back then, the value of our endowment was $110 million, US dollars. It's probably grown until since then. And this is important because this gives us, like I said, the possibility of looking at supporting project on the long run and having that stability and that vision of being able to say, if I want to sustain that, to support that project for 10 years, I can, because I know that I have a fund that allows me to do so, makes a huge difference sometimes in science. And so, of course, one needs to think about how much science is funded, but also how it's funded. And sometimes you getting, as a scientist, a small amount of money, but in a recurrent way for a number of years can make a huge difference. And sometimes more than getting a huge chunk of money that you have to spend very quickly. And so this is an important thing to remember. So we actually were the first private endowed institution supporting science and science outreach in Brazil. I think we still are. For science outreach, I'm pretty sure we are. And for science, I'm hoping that there will be more in the future. I know that there are other initiatives in the biomedical field, especially. Our structure and governance is simple. I can respond to more questions if you have some about this, but we basically have an executive team, very small. And the idea here is that we want to use our fund to give money to scientists and not to an executive team. And so it's very demanding to work here because those are long hours and very dedicated people. So it's a small, but I would say very efficient team. We have, of course, a scientific advisory board that is quite international, that 9 members. And we have a board of trustees, of course, and those are the people to whom we report. And then we use experts, of course, in different fields to evaluate our projects or to give us advice. So the scientific advisory board is the consultative body that gives us advice, but of course we do take advice from all different types of scientists, and we are now having a network of scientists with whom we work that is very large, and that's of course a huge strength for us. I'm not going to dwell much about what we do because it's all on our website, and I think I wanted to focus a little bit more on the diplomacy aspect. But we have basically 3 programs. One that is a scientific program where we basically select the best project we receive from young scientists, and those are people that are just coming back from their postdocs and they're just coming into Brazilian academy, and for a short amount of time they're eligible to our grants. And so this is a public call that we run every year, and where we select few grantees. So we always chose to select few and support few with large grants rather than support many with small grants. And the idea was to counterbalance what federal agencies at least were doing, because by essence we're different. I mean, they're public, we're private, and their budget is of course different from ours, although we are in a critical situation right now, and the budget is being cut in a way that is just, I think, unheard of anywhere in the world. So Brazilian science is under threat, it's important to say. And I think it has everything to do with the present government, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We have a training program. The training program is more recent. So the science program was the first program we launched. That was obvious. That was an easy thing to do. And now we are working on how to make that program grow. That is, trying to reach out to other categories of scientists, maybe scientists that are not even yet in the Brazilian system, to try to attract them back. Underrepresented scientists, for example. I mean, we're trying to see how to enlarge and to make the program grow in the most just way. The training program is a program in quantitative biology and ecology, is a program that we launched last year. And that results from what we've seen happening in the science program, in fact. So we saw that consistently math and to a certain extent theoretical physics came out very strong, and life science came out very strong in terms of quantity of proposal we received, but in terms of excellence in the evaluation process, and relative to the amount of project that we received from life science, we were surprised to see that these fields of biology and ecology were somewhat less competitive than what we expected. We of course had people of excellence, but we didn't have that critical mass, a huge amount of projects that were really good, and it wasn't too difficult, in fact, to do the selection, and that's usually a worrisome sign. And so we, after discussing with a few ecologists and biologists in Brazil, we decided to launch a training program with that has as an aim to use the strength that Brazil has already in mathematics and physics, and train more people to do biology and ecology, complex systems, basically, in a quantitative way, and basically apprehend things problems of life science in a complex way, which doesn't mean it has to be all mathematics, but it means that one needs to at least be able to grasp some of the complexity that is being observed using mathematics. So the idea is to really have a kind of super scientist that understands biology and ecology, but could use math and physics to solve some of these complex problems. And we had one edition of that. It was online, of course, because it was last year. And it was really, really interesting because we found some extremely talented young Brazilian and Latin American students. It was really impressive to see. We gathered 15 professors from all over the world, and all of them told us that they found the class to be one of the most reactive, spectacular, creative that they ever had. And so that gives us some hope in this moment of darkness that we are going through. And then the science outreach program, and that is something that I think probably Serrapilheira is more visible for by definition. And so the idea here is to support initiatives of outreach. And now we have a focus on media in a large sense of the term. That is journalism, science, that is social networks, podcasts, and any type of media, that the truth is. And this is being an extremely rewarding experience. We are now, I think, we are now supporting some of the most important initiatives in science outreach in Brazil, but still a lot is to be done. Okay. So I wanted to draw what are our values, the things that we really work for, and then I'll go through each and every one of them and try to tell you what lessons we've learned and how we're trying to address these things. So the first thing is excellence, scientific excellence. Like I said, address a big question. It may look like this doesn't require much diplomacy, but there's a few things that I think are interesting in here. But that's one of the things that, of course, we wanted to be known for, and so we had to gain credibility and everything. So excellence is really a strong core value of the Serrapilheira. Another thing that we wanted to do, because that's probably one of the largest problems in Brazil, is to fight against excessive red tape. I'll come back to why that is. It may sound weird to who is not from Brazil, but for any Brazilian scientist, I suppose, that will be extremely obvious that this is a fight that needs to be taken. The other thing is transparency and open science. This, I must confess, I mean, transparency is not easy, but I think that's okay. Open science is a complex matter, but it's something that we want to support as much as one can. The other important value is to promote diversity in science, and I'll try to show you numbers proving that this is absolutely required. And of course, the last thing is science communication and promoting science-based policies. So I'll go through each and every one of these themes. Those are 5 themes, and try to tell you shortly what we think about these. So excellence. Excellence may seem like an easy thing to say, and in fact, all institutions, scientific institutions, say that they go by excellence. But what we wanted to do here is basically change the way things are done here in the country. And so we wanted to give young Brazilian researchers the chance to think about what could be a high-risk proposal in their research field. This is critical because if you think about the way science is being, the way you get rewarded as a scientist in Brazil, pretty much all of the rewards that one can get come from your capacity of publishing a lot, not necessarily high quality, but high quantity. Of course, scientists are intelligent people, so the safest way to do this is to do low-risk research. If I tell you, the more you publish, the more you'll get rewarded, I'm going to cut my research in small pieces and pieces that I'm sure I can deliver. And that, of course, is important. That's what we call day science. It's important to do this type of science, but it's fundamental in a field like science to have at least part of your thinking process that goes to something that is wild. And wild means that you ask a question that is difficult, that lots of people are trying to solve, and that you take a risk. And that means that your project may not work. And of course, it's much more difficult for a public institution to accept that they will fund you with a great chance that your research will not be successful. That's difficult to do for a public funder. However, we're private, and so we are okay with this. And this is what we say in our editorial, in our public calls. You can take risk. So what we say to young researchers is, you could do your daily research, you could do everything you do usually, but there's a space where you could think about projects that are really, really different, really high risk, with little preliminary data. I would say a little bit, enough so that it gets interesting, and with a big idea and with new methodology. How are you going to be able to answer that old question that the whole field is trying to answer for decades, because you have that one idea that will make it different? It may fail, it may, but we're interesting to know how that works. So that, I think, is important, because when you open that way of provoking young researchers to do this, you are stimulating the field to think in a different way, or to at least have another way of proposing research proposals. Why is this diplomatic? This could be a little bit of scientific diplomacy, because we think that, of course, we are well poised because of our status to do that, but we think that any public institution may have at least part of its budget dedicated to this, because these projects are really the drivers, and they are the one where the big breakthrough will come from. And so the way we do this is we select international reviewers, entirely international reviewers, to not have conflict of interest, and this is key. And this is not the practice in most countries, and this is a pity. It's obvious that when you work with local reviewers, science is a small world, and everybody knows each other. And of course, if you see a great project coming from a good friend of yours, you may want to reward that project. It could be unconscious. Or it may come from an enemy of yours, and then you may want to block that project. And so the best way to circumpass this is to work with reviewers that are far from you, as far as possible. Of course, they're never completely far, and there's always a limit to the reviewing process, but I think within the reviewing practices, this is the best practice. And so that's what we do. It requires a lot of work, but we want this to be our standard. And it's important because by interacting with these international reviewers, they see our processes, they see how we work, and slowly we gain credibility. And we gain credibility through international partnerships with international reviewers, international institutions, and by getting credibility through these reviewers and through these institutions, we then gain credibility here, locally, in Brazil. And once we have that credibility and we have this methodology of reviewing, we are, of course, open to national exchanges with other institutions. So whatever institution wants to work with us and to select projects together with us using the way we do things, or adapting it to the way they want to do it, we are always open to exchange about this. And so this is a way of you making the whole idea of selection in science, which is key, more dynamic, with maybe changing a little bit the way it was set back decades ago for other reasons in another context. Now I think Brazil has got to a point where it's a large scientific country, and there's no reason that there would be no very high risk research in the entire country, not just in some states, but in the entire country. There's no reason for that to be a specificity of the Southeast region, for example. So that's the way we do it. And so we had a first phase of getting credibility through these international exchanges. And we are now discussing with lots of local institutions from the states or from the federal agencies. And we see this as absolutely essential. Red tape. I don't want to extend on this too much, but I think it's very important to mention this because I don't think there will be any Brazilian researcher that will not relate to this. This is probably one of the biggest hurdles that Brazilian scientists have to overcome to be competitive. So different from other countries, the amount of red tape that a scientist here has to go through is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And so we are private. And so for being private, we do not have to be very bureaucratic in the way we do things. And so when you have a public institution giving money to another public institution, it's a mess, and you never know where the mess comes from. When you have a private institution giving to a public institution, we see that it could be a mess still, but now we know where it comes from, and we can analyze it, and we can be critical about how things work or do not work in Brazil. And so we are doing our part in the sense that we do everything we can in order to make the researcher's life easier. So we've chosen a few partners, foundations, with whom we have worked our processes in such a way that whoever goes through that process of receiving money from the Serrapilheira Institute through these institutions, because that's the way it goes here, it will be minimal amount of red tape. And by doing this, we want to show that it is possible to do that. It is possible to do things in a more dynamic way. However, I must say that what we see, the law, when it comes to bureaucracy and to the way private and public institutions may interact in Brazil, is rather good. It's changed not too long ago. The problem is that the law is not being executed the way it is written. And this is because there's the law, and then there's the mindset. And the mindset of the people that have to execute the law is still like the law was 20 years ago, because the people making the law have done the job. The law is better. It's just that the people executing the law sometimes are not even aware of the present law. But most of the time, they are very resistant to making things more dynamic and apply the law, basically. And so this is why we've chosen these partners, because we thought we will never manage to get, because since it's a mindset problem, not so much a law problem, although there is some legal issues that has to be addressed, and that's another thing that I will not get into now because it would be too long, but it's the mindset that one has to change. And so if you choose a few partner institutions and slowly change their mindsets, slowly, it's a slow process, then you could show that yes, you could apply, you could work within the legal limits and be efficient. And that will give to our grantees a serious advantage. And again, it's not about the money, it's about how you can use the money, right? So this is key. And again, so what we do here is that we use what we are, and we choose a few partners, and then we make a case. We show that, okay, applying the law, going by the law, with a few partners that we've trained to have a different mindset and be more open, basically, we manage to do things in a more efficient way. So yes, it's possible. Yes, a public institution can interact with a private institution in an efficient way. And in fact, even a public institution could do that in a more efficient way. So we want to set an example, basically, when it comes to that issue. And it's a fundamental issue in Brazil. It's not a detail. This may sound like a detail from who is not from Brazil, but who works here knows that this is no detail. This is actually a huge amount of time that a researcher has to, so it's important to say that there's nobody in a department usually to take care of that. In most university, it's the own researcher that has to do this, that has to go through legal processes that are unbelievably complex, right? And so that's just not fair. It's as if you were running 100 meters, starting 20 meters before everybody else. So we have to make that as fair as possible so that Brazilian scientists could be as competitive as others, because they are as good with that, without a shred of a doubt. Transparency and open science, there I'd like to, so when it comes to transparency, we can only be exemplary. So we are absolutely transparent about the money we spend, how we spend it, who received our money, how much each and every one receives. And we ask our grantees to be as transparent as we are with the way they spend their money. Because there's always an old suspicion, I would say, that researchers, in fact, I don't know if it's specific to research, there's an old suspicion that people would, when you give them money, they would use the money for their own interest and do their thing. It's just not true. I mean, statistically speaking, researchers, when they get the money to do their research with it, and that's all they do. And the best way to just cut this argument of, oh no, but we don't know, we just received 1 million from I don't know what, or is to be very transparent about what we do with your money. So this is a simple measure that just cuts this debate short. And that is essential. So we do it of course, as an institution. We have an obligation of doing it, I would say, a moral obligation. So all of our accounts are published on our website and everybody can consult. And we ask all of us grantees to do that as well. When it comes to open science, we are of course favorable to having a science that is as open as possible. We finance studies on reproducibility at FAPERJ, actually. We try to tell our grantees to publish in open platforms. However, I must confess that this is a much more complex issue than just that. You know, this is wishful thinking, and this is great, but it's obvious that a young scientist has a great interest to publish in very prestigious journals, and these journals you have to pay, and they're not open. And of course, they could, put their stuff on archives or bioarchives, and that is one possibility, and that we strongly encourage our scientists to do. But we'd like the whole system to be more open to begin with. Now, the fee that these journals charge is just prohibitive. And so the reason why I'm written, the problem is larger than us, is that we cannot tell our grantees, do not publish in Nature or Science because they are not open. It is obvious that when you are starting your career, this can make a big difference. And so there's a systemic problem there. And I know that all of states and funding agencies are working actively on that. But I think when you have the size that we have, that is our budget is not huge. We've been proposed to participate of the Plan S, for example. Plan S means that you pay any fee that you have to pay to this journal so that your paper will be free, right? But these fees are huge. And so when you take an institution of our size, that would mean supporting much less researchers. And of course, that's not what we want. And so when you look at a specific public, young researchers that need to have these papers, of course, when you're a Nobel Prize winner, you could do without Nature and Science. But when you're a young guy, and if you have the chance to publish in these journals, it's a very different story. And when you're a small institution like we, you cannot just afford to pay on top all of the publication fees that these journals impose. So this is why I'm saying that the problem is much larger, and we of course discussing actively with other institutions in the world to try to see how we could participate in a more efficient way. But I have to say that this is a problem that's a little bit bigger than us. Okay, diversity. So diversity, and I'm taking too much time. I already said that I used to do that, but I try to be quick. This is probably the most difficult, the most tricky, the most complex problem in Brazil, and not just in science, but science just reflects the rest of the society. And so we're trying to promote diversity regionally in terms of gender and ethnicity as well. And for you to get a grasp about the size of the problem, those are the numbers of the proposals we received for our first call by states. So you could see that we received, out of 2,000 proposals, more or less, 500 came from the state of São Paulo. Half of the proposal, more than half, came from the Southeast region. Less than 74 proposals came from the whole region of the North, which is extremely small when you look at the size of the region. The Northeast submitted approximately the same amount as the South region, 300 and somewhat proposal, and the Central West 100. These numbers, they can vary from a year to the next, but basically the global picture is always the same. So we're trying to promote that regional diversity by going to these places where, and there are research institutes in these places, in Amazonia, in Pará. You could find people doing good research there. So our proposal is not enough in order to promote regional diversity, because it's based on application of people. And so when you have less applications, so we communicate more actively in these regions to promote, to try to make researchers apply. But what we do is that we fund other projects, and those are outside our call. And so we have, for example, a big math project in Ceará, and these projects are usually what we call structural projects. So they have to bring to the place where they happen an added value in terms of research structure, and so training people, bringing people over, international exchanges. This is how you try to have a nucleus of researchers trying to be, and it's amazing how when you start to have a small group of people working together, that place all of a sudden appear on the map, on the scientific map. There are extraordinary examples in Rio Grande do Norte, for example. So we know that this works. You have to fund things that are nuclear, that can give a nucleus of things, and that can work. And of course, it could not be completely disconnected from the place where you are. So Amazonia, for example, there are the obvious topics that could be researched there. It's easy. And so this is what we do. The Northeast, we fund some specific project, in the South as well. And this project has as an objective to develop a nucleus of people so that these numbers can progressively change, and we can in the next year see more projects coming from these regions. Gender equality is a difficult issue everywhere in the world. When you look at our numbers, they are not so bad globally. Men and women, 58-42, and these numbers oscillate, but it's close to equilibrium, I would say. The problem is when you look at the number by field, because we receive 2/3 of our projects come from life science, which is a field where a lot of women are active. The problem is when you go to math, physics, engineering, those fields are predominantly, are very much gender biased towards men. And so if you do the cutoff by field, you see that there's a lot of work to be done. So we have a series of measures that to promote the participation of women. First, we tell them to participate more. We are now thinking of giving specific chairs to underrepresented researchers. And we also give to women researchers an extra money in case of them getting pregnant, of having a young child, for example. That is obvious that we identify. I mean, that's an obvious thing to do. But we know that having a child is something that can slow down your scientific career, and sometimes that slowing down can be irreversible because it's a vicious circle. You have a child, you of course take some time off. Because you take some time off, your scientific production goes down. Because your scientific production goes down, you don't get money as easy as one can. Because you don't get money as easy, your scientific production doesn't go up again. And so we think that this is absolutely essential, that this is recognized. So for example, in our call, if you're a woman that has had 1 or 2 children, you have more time of eligibility. If you are one of our grantee, and if you have children during your grant period, we will give you extra money so that you could compensate by doing whatever you want with it. If you want to contract a babysitter, you can. If you want to have somebody working in your lab, in addition to boost your production, you can as well. You can do whatever you want with the extra money that we give you. But we think that this is important, that this being recognized. Without mentioning the fact that we support initiatives like Parents in Science, for example, that do work on getting data about that. One of the big accomplishments, and we're pretty proud of that, is that now when you have on your Brazilian CV, the LATS, you can actually mention as a woman that you've had children and when you've had them. It's crazy to think, but this was not the case until recently. So now at least the reviewer that goes through your process and goes through your CV could see that if you had a scientific production that has been a little bit less, that may be linked to the fact that you had a children like 9 months before, for example. That's trivial, but it's so this is the kind of initiative that we like, because it is a little bit of policy making and help scientists to do better. When it comes to ethnical diversity, the numbers are even more drastic. So this is, again, the number from our first proposal, but this is basically the same. We get 7% of our proposal coming from people who declare themselves as Afro-descendant. That is a shocking number, given the fact that more than half of the Brazilian population is Afro-descendant and declare itself as such. That reflects a terrible situation in the Brazilian academic system. And of course, and this is together with the fact that there's a quota policy happening already for a long time. It's just that we're not talking to students here, we're talking to young professors. And so as you go up the ladder of the university hierarchy, the number of underrepresented researchers just goes down. And so it is critical that this changes. And so we do this in very different ways, but we have diversity promoting mechanisms. And so, for example, a researcher that gets a grant from us has 30% of his grants that depends on his will to train young researchers from underrepresented groups. So it's not a small number. So if I give you 100, 70 you can have independently of anything. 30 you can have only if you train people, because the only way is to train these people to have more of them, to be more diverse. Not to mention that a research group that is diverse in ethnical background, gender, social background, is more productive scientifically. This is proven. And so that is key. So we do that, and this is what we could do on our side. But we try to promote this across, of course, with other institutions. So we participate, I think, actively of any debate on that matter. And these debates are not easy because there are strong resistance until today. Yeah, it may seem weird, but this is clear. We bring the issue up at any possible occasion, and then I'm saying, if we having a conversation with a local institution that wants to support science of excellence, we always mention the fact that we need to have some kind of mechanism to promote diversity, and that usually causes some kind of, this is not what we're talking about, and this is exactly what we're talking about. Excellence also goes through diversity. And we're basically trying to make the issue impossible to ignore, because it's just not possible that on the 21st century, we are still at that stage where a group of people is so underrepresented in what is supposed to be the most progressive force in the country. That's its academy. And so that is a strong advocacy that we do. Of course, again, having interactions with strong international institutions that do promote diversity is also a strength, because the same is true with excellence. If you, for example, HHMI in the States is now having programs that are entirely dedicated to promote ethnical diversity. And it is an institution that has a history of excellence. And so it's important that they do it, because they are known for excellence. And so if they will spend $2 billion in the next 10 years to promote diversity in research, it's because they think that this is not going to impinge on excellence. Because that idea that at the moment you open your selection process to diversity, you lower the standard, is wrong. I feel very awkward to say this because it's so obvious that I shouldn't have to say it again, but I'm saying it. It's a wrong idea. It's a wrong idea to think that if you have some kind of a diversity promoting mechanism, you lose on the scientific quality of your proposal. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong simply because some people had less opportunity to begin with, which doesn't mean that when they will come to your lab, they won't be fantastic. It's just that you have to give them an initial push because their parents were poor, because they grew up in very difficult conditions. I mean, this is the basics. And so what you do is basically bridging that gap that the society has created for hundreds of years. It's not very much. And we get emails all the time telling us, I got this guy from a low social background, and it's impressive. The guy is really good. I'm surprised. I'm like, yeah, of course. What do you think? That there was a category of people that was going to be less good? No, it's not like this. Of course, you have to invest in them. You have to train them. You have to be proactive. It's just like anybody else. It's true for our children as well. If we train them hard so that they're good. And so it's the same principle. It sounds very basic, but it's not so basic. And so we have to be extremely vocal about this. Okay, this is my last point, and I'm taking way too much time, and then I'll stop. Science communication and policy making, those are two things that are very intertwined in our mind. We want to, getting science visible to a large public. And for that, we shoot in all directions. and trying to, make people talk about science generally. We want to explain the scientific method in a simple way rather than explaining a scientific finding. The scientific finding doesn't tell you much. The scientific method, the way scientists think, is what's interesting. And we've seen during the pandemic that clearly people do not know how that goes. They think that it's all written, it's all golden, you cannot do wrong hypothesis. So this is not how science works. So we want to explain to people how science works. And we want to make them understand that having a little bit of rational thinking can help scientists, but can help other people. And so it's a way of thinking the world, which is not exclusive. You don't need to think just that way, but it's something that can help. It's always good. We are promoting actively the approximation of Brazilian journalists to scientists. We've seen again that lots of Brazilian journalists covering science-related projects or science-related topics do not have any training about science and sometimes write wrong stuff. And so we are now promoting and funding training program basically for journalists to have that basic training of knowing how to cover any kind of topic with a little bit of science in it. And we want to promote science-based policy making, of course. So when it comes to the science communication, there's a few things that I'd like to say. It's important to realize that scientists are not always the best communicators, and that sometimes the best communicators were people that were trained in science but are no longer scientists, and that's okay because they are communicators. So the idea that any scientist should be a great communicator is wrong. Some are, and that's great, but some are just not good at this. And that's okay, because a scientist should produce science. That's what they should do. And they should be, but what we want them to be is to be the source of information for the communicators or the policymakers. This is their job, the most important job. If they communicate and they do it well, great. That's a plus. But if not, what they have to do is to be available to give the right information to the communicators and to the policymakers. This is important because otherwise you may make the scientists feel like they have to do something that they're not trained for, that they're not good at. It's not anybody who goes to YouTube and does something that has millions of followers. And so it's better than a scientist talk to the guys who has 1 million of followers on YouTube than he trying or she trying to do a YouTube herself. Sometimes it's going to be a catastrophe. It's not going to be beautiful. It's not going to be produced. And so zero. And so it's important. And the other thing that's important is that the communicator does not necessarily belong to the academic world, but he needs to be funded. And so in Brazil right now, if you're a science communicator and you're not in the academy, there's basically no funding agency that can fund you. So this is why we do it, because we think that they are a key component of the communication chain between academy and the general public and policymakers. So most of the science outreach grants in Brazil, they come with a science grant. So if you're a scientist, you apply for a grant, and in that grant, you have a small part of the money to do science outreach. But what about the guy who's not in academy? He cannot even apply to FAPESP or FAPERJ or FAP, whatever. So that's a problem because you need to fund that. Those are professionals. They need to live. And if you don't fund them, the risk is that some kind of industry will fund them and will probably alter the message. And so for them to be independent, they need to get either public funding or philanthropic funding. It's absolutely key. The other thing is that we try it's clear to us that the communicators should communicate about science, and they don't need to be a scientist. They don't need to present themselves as a scientist, and they're not policymakers. I'm saying this because of the pandemic. We've seen a lot of communicators taking stands that are just way above what they should take. And one needs to know its place. It's absolutely essential. So it is important for us that the people who communicate science do it from what the point of view of who they are. Just like scientists should communicate, if they want to, about science, but they don't have more credibility to communicate about politics than you or me. So this was a little bit, it's a little bit, because when you talk from the scientific point of view, you have that authority of science. And it's important to not abuse of that authority and use it in a wise way so that your message could be heard and could be accepted. Because if you say, look, the epidemiological situation right now says this and this and that, and this is what the policymakers should take into consideration with other things that they also need to take into consideration, you are in where you should be. If you say, look, the epidemiological situation right now is saying this and this, and therefore I think that the mayor should do this, the president should do that, and you are out of this is now no longer and you're using science as an argument of authority to enter into a field where you do not have credibility. You're not elected by anybody. So one has to know its place. And this is, in this whole game of science communication, this is the most important thing. And the policymakers, of course, they must make their policy based on science, and they must be in touch with scientists. And there's a huge work to be done because it's not the case. So during the pandemic, we've seen policymakers being in touch with communicators that were not scientists as well. And so we've seen policies designed by people that are not scientists at all. And that is extremely dangerous. So what we're trying to do in funding this, we do fund all of these initiatives, but we try to making very clear what is the role of each and every one of these actors. And this has to be very well worked out. Otherwise, it could be very confused. And this is extremely problematic because this gives rise to fake news, to all of the things that we've seen happening so far. And in this situation, and I would end here, we need to do a special effort. This effort of promoting actions to promote science-based policy making should always be done. But we're investing as well to promote that because we think that is very important. Okay, I think I'm finished. I want to thank you for your attention. I spoke too much, but I always do that, so I'm sorry.